We are all just neon ghosts haunting the streets of our own memories and forgotten dreams. Join our exploration of the past and the lingering echoes of the choices we once made in the dark. Click subscribe now and face the ghosts of your own cinematic journey.
The ink on my father's will wasn't even dry before my aunt started redecorating his house in her head. I was standing in the living room of the home I grew up in, the same living room where my father taught me to read stock charts on Saturday mornings, where he'd pour 2 mugs of coffee and say, "Lily, the numbers always tell the truth, even when people don't." The furniture still smelled like him, that particular mix of cedar and old paper and something I couldn't name but recognized as safety. And my Aunt Patrice was standing next to the fireplace, running her fingers along the mantel like she was already measuring for new curtains. My cousin Trevor stood beside her, not touching anything, but watching everything. He had that look he always gets when he thinks he's about to win something. I've known that look since we were 8 years old and he cheated a Monopoly and didn't understand why it bothered me. He still doesn't. Mr. Ellison, our family's estate attorney, sat at the dining table with a manila folder in front of him and the particular stillness of a man who has delivered bad news so many times it no longer registers on his face. He cleared his throat. My aunt sat down. Trevor sat down. I sat down. I already knew what the will said. I had helped my father write it. What I didn't know, what none of us knew yet, was that by the time Mr. Ellison finished reading, the worst thing that had ever happened to me would also become the most expensive mistake my aunt had ever made. Let me back up. My name is Lily, and I'm 31 years old. My father spent 40 years building Hargrove Technical Solutions from a 2-person consulting firm into a mid-sized defense contractor with government clearances and a client list that included 3 federal agencies. He was not a flashy man. He drove the same Volvo for 11 years. He wore the same brand of watch his whole adult life. He believed in building things slowly and making sure every single brick was load-bearing before you put up the next one. He also believed in me in a way that I didn't fully understand until he was gone. I'm a patent attorney. Specifically, I specialize in intellectual property for defense and aerospace technology. My father used to joke that I was the only person who could make intellectual property law sound like a thriller novel. I would argue the stakes are genuinely that high. A single patent can be worth more than the physical product it protects, and the people who understand that hold a specific kind of leverage that most people never see coming. My Aunt Patrice is my father's younger sister. She's the kind of woman who mistakes confidence for competence and has never once been corrected by reality because she surrounds herself with people who need something from her. She married well twice, divorced better twice, and has spent the last 20 years living in a beautiful home in Scottsdale on the combined proceeds of both settlements. She's not stupid. I want to be accurate about that. She's strategic in the way that people who've never had to actually build anything can be strategic. She moves resources around, she doesn't create them. Trevor is her son. He's 34, has an MBA from a school that costs more than it teaches, and has spent 6 years consulting for companies his mother connected him to. He smiles at you in a way that makes you feel like you're both in on a joke, and then you realize later that you were the joke. They had been circling my father for the last 2 years of his illness. I watched it happen and I didn't stop it, and that's the thing I have to live with. Not because I didn't see it. I saw every dinner invitation, every sudden interest in his medical appointments, every just checking in phone call that always seemed to happen right after a doctor's visit. I saw it because I grew up with a man who taught me to read patterns. But my father was dying and he wanted his family around him, and I didn't have the heart to take that from him. So I watched, and I prepared. What Patrice didn't know was that 6 months before my father passed, he and I had a very long conversation at his kitchen table with 2 mugs of coffee. He told me everything he wanted. I told him everything I'd already structured. He laughed, that quiet, satisfied laugh he had when the numbers worked out exactly right. He said, "You really are my daughter." Mr. Ellison opened the folder. The will was straightforward in its surface reading. The house, the personal assets, the investment accounts, split between me and Patrice with specific sentimental items designated for specific people. My father was fair to everyone, even people who didn't deserve it. That was his nature. Then Mr. Ellison got to Hargrove Technical Solutions. Patrice sat up straighter. Trevor put both hands flat on the table. The company, Mr. Ellison read, including all operational assets, client contracts, and physical property, was to be transferred jointly to Lily Hargrove and Patrice Calloway with equal operational standing. Patrice exhaled. It was a small sound, but I heard it, the sound of 6 years of planning paying off. Trevor caught her eye and she gave him the tiniest nod. I kept my face very still. What Mr. Ellison had not yet read, what came in the next paragraph, was the intellectual property clause. My father had spent 4 decades building client relationships and operational infrastructure. But the actual engine of Hargrove Technical Solutions, the thing that made it worth anything beyond furniture and office leases, was a portfolio of 17 proprietary methodologies and 2 registered patents related to secure communications architecture for federal contractors. Without those, the company was a name on a letterhead and a list of relationships that couldn't be leveraged without the technical foundation underneath them. Those patents and all associated IP were not part of Hargrove Technical Solutions. They had been transferred 14 months prior to a separate LLC called Meridian IP Holdings. Sole member, Lily Hargrove. Mr. Ellison read that part very quietly. The room did something interesting then. It didn't go loud. It went the kind of still that happens when a sound is so unexpected that the brain takes a full second to process it as real. I watched my aunt's face move through 4 distinct expressions in about 2 seconds: confusion, calculation, fury, and then a very controlled return to neutral that told me everything I needed to know about how she was going to play this. She was not going to fold. She was going to fight. That was fine. I'd already won. She just didn't know it yet. What happened next took 3 weeks. I want to be honest about that, because I think there's a version of this story where I make it sound like everything clicked into place in one dramatic afternoon, and that's not true. What actually happened was slower and more exhausting and involved a lot of very long phone calls with my own attorney and a lot of nights sitting in my car in parking garages because I needed somewhere to cry where nobody could find me. My father was gone. Whatever else was true, that was true first. Patrice moved quickly. I expected that. She hired a business attorney within 48 hours and formally contested the IP transfer, arguing that the patents were inseparable from the company's operations and that separating them constituted a fraudulent conveyance designed to diminish her inheritance. That word, fraudulent, was a choice. She said it in documents. She put it in writing. My attorney, a woman named Gwendolyn, who has been doing IP litigation for 22 years, and has the particular calm of someone who has never lost a case she cared about winning, read the filing and said, "They have no idea what they're looking at." I asked her what she meant. She said, "They think the patents are the ceiling. They don't realize they're also the floor." Here's what my aunt's attorney didn't understand, and what Trevor's MBA had apparently failed to cover. The 2 registered patents in the Meridian portfolio weren't just proprietary methodologies. They were the foundational architecture for a next-generation secure communications protocol that 3 different federal agencies were currently in active acquisition discussions to license. Not buy, license. Annually, the projected licensing revenue over a 10-year contract cycle was north of $40 million, and that number was sitting in a preliminary term sheet in a folder that my aunt's attorney had never asked to see because he didn't know to ask. The company she had just inherited half of was worth approximately $4 million without the IP. The IP she was suing to invalidate was worth approximately $40 million and climbing. I sat with that for a moment, every time I felt the grief trying to pull me under. My father had spent his whole life making sure the people he loved were protected. He'd just done it one last time. Patrice called me directly on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in my office, eating a salad I didn't want, reading deposition transcripts. I almost didn't answer. I answered. "I think we should talk," she said. Her voice had that specific texture of someone who has decided to be reasonable after concluding that being unreasonable isn't working. "Family shouldn't be in court." "I agree," I said, and I meant it. Not because I was afraid of court. Because I'd been dreading this conversation for months and I wanted it over. "Your father wanted us to work together," she said. "That's what the will says. Equal operational standing. I think he would want us to find a way to make this work." This is the part that required everything I had, because she wasn't entirely wrong. My father did want the family to work together. He wanted Patrice to have a stake in something real, to be connected to something he built, He told me that. He'd also told me he wasn't naive and that he trusted me to handle whatever came after. What are you proposing? I asked. She proposed that I transfer the Meridian IP back into Hargrove Technical Solutions, restoring the company to its full value, at which point we would operate as equal partners. She framed it as reconciliation. She framed it as honoring my father's intentions. What she was actually proposing was that I hand her $20 million in exchange for the privilege of working alongside her son. I let her finish. I didn't interrupt once. Then I said, Patrice, I'm going to explain something to you, and I need you to hear it not as your niece but as the patent attorney who structured this transaction. What you're asking me to do isn't legally possible under the current licensing framework. The Meridian portfolio has already entered preliminary binding discussions with federal counterparties. Any structural change to the ownership entity would trigger a mandatory disclosure requirement that would pause the acquisition process for a minimum of 18 months. The agencies don't like instability in IP ownership chains. It makes them nervous, and nervous agencies don't sign contracts. Silence. So what you're actually asking me to do, I continued, is blow up a $40 million federal contract pipeline so that you can own half of something you didn't build. And I won't do that, not because I'm angry at you, but because my father spent 40 years building something real, and I'm not going to let it fall apart to settle a dispute. More silence. The company is yours, I said. Half of it exactly as the will states. The client relationships are yours to steward. The office, the staff, the operational history, all of it exactly as my father intended. But the IP stays with Meridian. Those were his wishes, and they were legally executed 14 months ago, and no court is going to overturn a valid transfer made by a competent adult to his own daughter, especially when that daughter is the attorney who built the underlying legal structure. She hung up. The lawsuit was dropped 11 days later. I found out through Gwendolyn, who sent me a 2-word text. It's done. I sat in my office for a long time after that, not celebrating, not relieved exactly. Something quieter than either of those things. The federal licensing deal closed 4 months later. $38 million over 8 years, with renewal options. Gwendolyn opened the bottle of champagne in her conference room, and I drank 1 glass and then went home and sat on my apartment floor and talked to my father out loud for about an hour, which I know sounds strange. But I think sometimes you just need to say things to the person who would have understood them best. I told him the numbers worked out. I told him every brick was load-bearing. I told him I missed him every single day and that I was going to be okay. What I haven't told you yet is the part that actually cost my aunt the most, and it wasn't the lawsuit or the licensing revenue. It was what happened with the company itself. Because here is the thing about Hargrove Technical Solutions without its IP foundation, it still had value. Real value. The client relationships my father had built were genuine. The reputation was solid. In the right hands, with real operational leadership and a strategy to develop new proprietary methodology, it could have grown into something substantial on its own. But Patrice didn't know how to run it and didn't hire anyone who did. She installed Trevor as co-CEO within 60 days of the estate closing. He made 3 major personnel decisions in the first quarter, all of them wrong. 2 senior engineers who had been with the company for over a decade resigned within 6 months. One of those engineers, a woman who'd built half of the secure architecture my father's patents were based on, took a position at a competitor and brought 2 client relationships with her, which she was fully legally entitled to do because Trevor had let her non-compete lapse during the transition. I know all of this because people called me, my father's people. The ones who'd worked with him for years. They didn't call to give me information as a weapon. They called because they were sad and confused and they wanted to tell someone who would understand what was being lost. I understood. I didn't intervene. It wasn't mine to intervene in. But I want to be honest about that too, about how it felt to watch something my father loved be slowly mishandled by people who saw it as an asset to extract rather than a thing to tend. That part was not clean or satisfying. That part was just grief, wearing a different coat. By the 18-month mark, Patrice had hired a business broker to explore a sale. The company sold for $2.1 million, half of which was hers. She called me once more after the sale closed. I don't know what she expected. Maybe she thought I would gloat. Maybe she thought I would apologize. Maybe she just needed someone to be angry at, and I was the most available option. I picked up. I always pick up. That's the thing about me that I think surprises people. I'm not cold. I'm just precise. You planned all of this, she said. My father planned most of it, I said. I just executed. He wouldn't have wanted this. I thought about that Saturday morning kitchen table. The coffee, the stock charts, the way he'd look at me over his reading glasses and say, the numbers always tell the truth. He wanted me protected, I said. He wanted the work he did to mean something. He wanted you to have something real. You had all of that. What you did with it was your choice. She didn't respond. Take care of yourself, Patrice, I said. And I meant it. Not warmly exactly, but genuinely. She's my father's sister. She's the only living connection I have to a version of him I never got to meet. The young version. The brother. The boy who grew up in the same house. That matters to me, even when she doesn't. I hung up. I blocked her number 6 weeks later, after the third message from Trevor asking if I wanted to grab coffee and reconnect. I'm precise, not a saint. Here's what I know now, that I didn't know the morning I sat in that living room watching my aunt run her fingers along my father's mantle. Grief is not a single room. It's more like a building. You can be in the lobby dealing with logistics and also simultaneously be on the 14th floor absolutely falling apart, and those two things can be true at the same time without either of them canceling the other out. My father knew he was dying for 2 years. He spent those 2 years making sure that I would be standing on solid ground when he was gone. He did that not by giving me money, though the Meridian portfolio has been more than I'll ever need, but by teaching me to build things correctly from the beginning, by showing me that the difference between an asset and a legacy is whether it can survive without you. The patents are mine, the company is sold, the litigation is done, and I am, for the first time in my adult life, working on something that has nothing to do with protecting what I have and everything to do with building what comes next. My father would have opinions about my strategy. He'd probably suggest I'm moving too fast in one area and not fast enough in another. He'd want to see the numbers. He'd pour 2 mugs of coffee. I pour 2 mugs of coffee. I pour 2 mugs sometimes anyway. Old habit. The second one gets cold. That's fine. The numbers still tell the truth. That part hasn't changed. People ask me sometimes if I regret how it all played out. If I wish I'd done something differently, warned Patrice earlier, tried harder to stop Trevor from running the company into the ground, picked up the phone when she called that last time with something other than composure. Honestly, I've sat with that question long enough to know the answer isn't simple. But here's what I keep coming back to. The outcomes in this story weren't random. They were the direct result of what each person chose to build and what each person chose to take. My father spent 40 years building something real. He woke up early, he stayed late, he made hard calls that didn't pay off for years, and he never once tried to shortcut the foundation. He taught me that the structure has to be honest before the walls go up. You can't fake load-bearing work. It holds or it doesn't, and eventually the weight always tells the truth. Patrice and Trevor made a different choice. They didn't build. They positioned. They spent years cultivating access to something they hadn't earned, and when they finally got it, they treated it like a prize to be divided rather than a responsibility to be carried. That's not a moral failing in some abstract sense, it's just a practical one. You cannot sustain what you do not understand, and you cannot grow what you have never tended. The company collapsed, not because I structured things to punish them, but because they ran it the way people run things when they believe ownership is the same as competence. It isn't. I think about Lily, the version of me at 22, working 80-hour weeks, studying for the bar while also doing contract review to pay rent, calling my father on Sunday nights to go over case strategy because I couldn't afford to waste a move. That version of me wasn't impressive. She was just determined. She had decided that the only thing nobody could ever take from her was the knowledge she'd built inside her own head. So she kept building it, patent after patent, structure after structure. Not because she knew someday she'd need it as armor, but because she believed that real work compounds. That effort laid down correctly doesn't disappear. It becomes the floor you stand on when everything else shakes. That's what got me through the 14 months after my father's diagnosis. Not strategy exactly, just the habit of doing the next right thing, the next careful thing, making sure every brick was load-bearing before I put up the next one. He taught me that. I was just finally doing it for both of us. The hardest part of this whole story isn't Patrice or Trevor or the lawsuit or the sale. The hardest part is that my father is gone. Everything else is just numbers. And the numbers, like he always said, tell the truth, eventually, to everyone, whether they're ready to hear it or not. I'm still building. That part doesn't stop. I don't think it's supposed to.